There is a piece of land on this planet where the ground beneath your feet is 81% of the time not actually ground at all. It's ice, in some places nearly 2 miles thick, pressing down on bedrock that hasn't seen open sky in over 100,000 years. The winters last for months without a sunrise. The nearest hospital for some residents is a boat ride and a plane ride away. The economy of the entire territory rests almost entirely on one industry, fishing, in waters that are warming 4 times faster than the global average. And yet, right now, at this exact moment, close to 57,000 people call this place home, by choice, generation after generation, even as the President of the United States has spent the past several months publicly, repeatedly, and at times aggressively pushing to acquire the land out from under them. This is Greenland, and the story of why people live there and why so many of them are refusing to leave, even as the world's most powerful country eyes their home, is far stranger and far more human than most people realize. Let's start with the basic, almost absurd scale of the place, because without understanding the geography, nothing else about this story makes sense. Greenland is the largest island on Earth, so large that if you overlaid its outline onto a map of Western Europe, it would stretch from the southern coast of Spain to well past the northern tip of Norway. And yet, across that entire enormous landmass, only around 56 to 57,000 people live there in total. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the population of a single mid-sized American suburb spread across a territory more than 3 times the size of Texas. The reason for that almost impossible sparseness becomes clear the moment you understand what actually covers the land. Roughly 81% of Greenland sits permanently buried beneath an ice sheet, a frozen mass so immense and so old that, in its thickest sections, it plunges more than 2 miles down to bedrock that has been sealed away from sunlight and open air for over 100,000 years. This isn't seasonal ice, the kind that melts and reforms with the changing months. This is a genuinely ancient, permanent glacial dome, one of only 2 ice sheets left on the entire planet, the other being Antarctica's, and it dominates the interior so completely that virtually every single person who lives in Greenland does so along a narrow ribbon of ice-free coastline, hugging the edges of a landmass whose center is almost entirely uninhabitable by any practical measure. Given that reality, the question in the title of this piece isn't rhetorical at all. It's genuinely one of the more interesting human geography puzzles on the planet. Why would 50,000 or so people choose, generation after generation, to remain rooted to a landmass that is this hostile, this remote, and this economically fragile when leaving for Denmark, which governs Greenland as a semi-autonomous territory within its kingdom, would be entirely legal and relatively straightforward? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't singular. It's a combination of deep cultural identity, genuine economic opportunity in specific industries, a fierce and increasingly politically significant sense of sovereignty, and for many residents, something that's harder to quantify but shows up again and again in interviews and public statements from Greenlanders themselves, an attachment to a landscape and a way of life that they simply don't want to trade away, regardless of how difficult the life can sometimes be. To understand who actually lives in Greenland today, you have to go back much further than the modern territory's political relationship with Denmark. Nearly 90% of Greenland's current population is of Inuit origin, descendants of the Thule people who migrated across the Arctic from present-day Canada roughly 1,000 years ago, arriving in a land that had already seen earlier waves of Paleo-Inuit settlement stretching back thousands of years before that. These weren't accidental settlers stumbling onto a frozen wasteland with no other options. Inuit culture across the entire Arctic developed an extraordinarily sophisticated set of technologies and traditional knowledge specifically adapted to thriving, not merely surviving, in exactly this kind of environment. Kayaks and umiaks designed for hunting sea mammals in frigid coastal waters. Clothing systems using layered animal hides and furs engineered for warmth without the crushing weight that would make hunting or travel impossible. Deep intergenerational knowledge of sea ice conditions, animal migration patterns, and weather systems that allowed communities to predict and adapt to an environment that would kill an unprepared outsider within hours. This isn't ancient history disconnected from the present. Many of these traditional skills and cultural practices remain actively woven into daily life across Greenland's coastal towns and villages today, passed down through families who have occupied the same stretches of coastline for countless generations. Layered on top of that deep Inuit heritage is Greenland's more recent political history, which shapes an enormous amount of how residents today think about their relationship to the land itself. Greenland was colonized by Denmark beginning in the 18th century, and for a significant portion of the 20th century, it was governed essentially as a Danish colony, with decisions about Greenlandic life, economy, and culture made largely from Copenhagen rather than by Greenlanders themselves. That relationship has shifted substantially over the past several decades. In 2009, Greenland was granted a significant expansion of self-governance through what's known as the Self-Government Act, giving the territory control over most of its own domestic affairs, including natural resources, while Denmark retained authority specifically over foreign policy, defense, and monetary policy, along with continuing to provide the annual financial support that remains central to Greenland's economy. This history matters enormously to understanding contemporary Greenlandic identity, because a substantial portion of the population has spent decades actively working toward greater independence from Denmark, not toward closer integration with any other foreign power, a detail that becomes critically important once you understand what's been happening over the past year. One detail about land ownership in Greenland captures something essential about how differently residents there relate to their own territory compared to most Western nations, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. In Greenland, no individual person or private entity can actually own land. All land is held collectively, administered through the government rather than bought, sold, and privately deeded the way property works across most of Europe and North America. Greenlandic community leaders have pointed out that this structure makes any outside discussion of simply acquiring or purchasing Greenland feel especially jarring and disrespectful to residents, because the entire premise misunderstands or ignores the fact that Greenlandic land was never conceived of as something that exists to be bought and sold as real estate in the first place. It's held in trust for the collective use and benefit of the people who live there, a fundamentally different relationship to place than the transactional framing that's dominated recent international headlines about the territory. Now, to the economics, because this is where Greenland's genuine fragility becomes impossible to ignore, and it's central to understanding both why life there is challenging and why the current geopolitical attention on the island carries such real stakes for the people living through it. Greenland's economy is small, narrow, and heavily concentrated. Gross domestic product sits somewhere in the range of $3.5 to $4 billion, an almost impossibly small figure by the standards of national or even regional economies elsewhere in the developed world. The overwhelming majority of that economic activity flows from a single source: fishing. Cod, shrimp, and Greenland halibut, harvested from the cold waters surrounding the island, account for roughly 90% of Greenland's total exports, and the fishing industry alone provides around 15% of all jobs across the territory. In the smaller, more remote coastal villages, some with populations as modest as 150 residents, this dependence is even more absolute. These are communities where nearly the entire local economy, and in many cases the entire diet, revolves around what can be caught or hunted from the surrounding marine environment, a pattern of subsistence and commercial fishing that connects directly back to those same traditional Inuit practices passed down over centuries. Beyond fishing, Greenland's public finances depend heavily on financial support from Denmark, which provides an annual block grant currently worth around 605 million Danish kroner, translating to roughly $10,000 for every single resident of the territory each year. That's not a minor supplementary subsidy. It represents a substantial share of the funding that keeps Greenland's healthcare system, education infrastructure, and broader public services functioning at anything resembling the standards residents have come to expect. Denmark's central bank, in an assessment published earlier this year, delivered a notably blunt warning about where Greenland's economy currently stands. Growth has been slowing consistently, down to less than 1% annually in recent years, compared to 2% as recently as 2022. And the report specifically flagged that liquidity in the Greenlandic treasury fell to what officials described as a critically low level during the latter half of last year, forcing the territory's government to roll out urgent fiscal tightening measures. Layered on top of these near-term financial pressures is a longer, slower demographic crisis that may ultimately prove even more consequential. Greenland's population, already just under 57,000 people, is projected to shrink by roughly 20% by 2050, driven by an aging population, and the territory's ongoing struggle to attract enough migrants, or convince enough young Greenlanders to remain and replace those who leave for education or opportunity elsewhere, most commonly in Denmark itself. This combination, a strikingly narrow economic base, heavy reliance on foreign financial support, and a demographic outlook trending toward long-term population decline, paints a genuinely difficult picture for Greenland's near and medium-term future. And yet, this is precisely the moment at which Greenland has found itself thrust unexpectedly into the very center of major international geopolitics, transformed almost overnight from a quiet, remote Arctic territory that most of the world rarely thought about into one of the most actively discussed pieces of land on the planet. The reason traces back to a series of statements and actions from President Donald Trump, who has repeatedly and increasingly forcefully pushed for the United States to acquire Greenland. Trump first floated the idea publicly back in 2019, during his first term in office, a proposal that was widely dismissed at the time as an unserious, almost bizarre aside, rather than genuine policy. That changed dramatically this year. Beginning in January, Trump escalated his rhetoric substantially, describing the acquisition of Greenland as vital to safeguarding United States national security and explicitly framing it as necessary for countering growing Chinese influence in the Arctic region. In an interview with NBC News, Trump stated he was, in his words, very serious about acquiring the island. And in comments to reporters the day before, he argued the United States needs Greenland specifically to bolster national security. Vice President J.D. Vance added further pressure, publicly accusing Denmark of failing to adequately keep Greenland secure, and in December, Trump appointed Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry to serve as a formal special envoy focused specifically on Greenland, a move that signaled the administration intended this push to be an ongoing, structured policy priority rather than a passing rhetorical flourish. What's driving this level of American interest, beyond the broad national security framing, comes down substantially to what sits beneath Greenland's ice, and to the island's genuinely critical strategic location. Greenland holds a wealth of largely untapped mineral resources, including deposits of rare earth elements, oil, natural gas, and other materials considered essential for modern high-technology industries and green energy infrastructure. As global demand for these specific materials has surged, driven by everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced electronics manufacturing, and as most current global rare earth production remains concentrated in China, Greenland's largely unexplored mineral wealth has taken on outsized strategic significance in the eyes of American policymakers looking to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains. Beyond minerals, Greenland's location carries enormous military and strategic weight purely due to geography. The island sits along critical Arctic shipping and surveillance routes, and the United States has maintained a military presence there for decades already through Patuxent Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, which plays a role in missile warning systems and space surveillance operations. As melting Arctic ice gradually opens new shipping routes and increases the accessibility of previously locked-away resources across the wider Arctic region, competition among major powers, the United States, Russia, and China among them, for influence and access across the Arctic has intensified considerably, and Greenland sits directly at the center of that broader contest. For the people actually living in Greenland, though, this sudden surge of international attention has landed as something closer to an unwelcome, even alarming intrusion rather than an exciting economic opportunity. Public opinion within Greenland has been remarkably clear and consistent. The overwhelming majority of residents oppose any American takeover of their homeland. This opposition hasn't remained confined to opinion polls or private conversation. Thousands of Greenlanders took to the streets in organized protests against Trump's acquisition push, with thousands more demonstrating in solidarity across Denmark itself. Greenland's political leadership has echoed this sentiment directly and unambiguously. The territory's prime minister publicly rebuked Trump's comments, and other prominent Greenlandic voices have pushed back forcefully against the entire framing of the discussion. One resident, quoted in international coverage of the controversy, made a point that captures much of the underlying frustration driving these protests. Given that no individual can privately own land in Greenland at all, treating the territory as though it were a piece of real estate available for national purchase, struck many residents as fundamentally disrespectful of how Greenlanders themselves actually relate to their own land and sovereignty. Greenland's own political leadership has been consistent on one central point throughout this entire controversy, even as they've simultaneously acknowledged genuine interest in stronger economic ties with the United States, specifically around resource development. The territory has stated clearly that it remains open for business, welcoming foreign investment and partnership in developing its mineral resources and broader economy, but has been equally clear that it does not wish to become part of the United States. This distinction, welcoming economic partnership while firmly rejecting the idea of political annexation, has been a consistent thread running through statements from Greenlandic officials throughout the past year, even as pressure from Washington has continued to intensify. The political stakes of this entire controversy became directly visible in Greenland's own democratic process this year. The territory's prime minister announced a general election held on March 11th, and the campaign leading up to that vote centered substantially on exactly these questions. Greenland's own long-standing aspirations toward eventual full independence from Denmark, the future of its relationship with Denmark going forward, and how to navigate the sudden, unprecedented pressure coming from the United States, all layered on top of the more familiar ongoing debate about the territory's genuinely fragile economy and its heavy dependence on Danish financial support and the fishing industry. It's worth pausing on the layered irony embedded directly within that election. For years, a meaningful and often vocal portion of Greenland's population has actively pushed toward greater independence, specifically from Denmark, viewing full sovereignty as the ultimate goal of decades of gradual political self-governance. That independence movement has continued running in parallel with, and in clear tension against, growing American pressure toward a completely different kind of dependency, one framed not as a path toward self-determination, but as a takeover by an entirely different, considerably more powerful foreign government. Many Greenlanders have found themselves navigating this awkward, uncomfortable position, wanting more control over their own affairs and less dependence on Denmark, while simultaneously wanting absolutely nothing to do with trading that relationship for control by the United States instead. Denmark, for its part, has responded to this entire situation by significantly increasing its own investment and engagement with Greenland in what reads clearly as an effort to shore up a relationship that has, for decades, carried real friction and historical grievance, while working to head off any further drift toward American influence. Earlier this year, Denmark pledged approximately $253 million specifically toward infrastructure and healthcare investments in Greenland, spread across the period from 2026 through 2029. Danish officials have been explicit that this increased spending reflects a direct response to intensifying international interest in Greenland and an effort to strengthen ties with the territory's residents at a moment when those ties are facing unusual external pressure. It represents a genuinely interesting real-time example of how geopolitical competition over a specific piece of territory can translate almost immediately into tangible domestic policy shifts and increased spending commitments, playing out in real time as this controversy has continued to unfold. There's yet another layer to Greenland's current situation that connects directly back to the physical, environmental reality of daily life there, and it may ultimately prove just as consequential to the territory's future as anything happening in Washington or Copenhagen. Greenland is warming at a rate roughly 4 times faster than the global average, a pace of change that is already reshaping the practical realities of life across the island in ways residents are witnessing firsthand rather than reading about in distant scientific reports. This past January, Greenland recorded its warmest January on record, with preliminary readings from the Danish Meteorological Institute in the capital city of Nuuk averaging just above freezing, dramatically above the historical average temperature for that month, which typically sits well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The head of Denmark's National Center for Climate Research described this warming trend as clearly, undeniably visible across Greenland already, not a distant future projection, but a lived, present reality. This accelerated warming carries direct consequences for the fishing industry that the entire territory's economy depends on. Sea ice now extends less far south along the coastline each winter than it once did, and even where ice does form, it tends to be measurably thinner, making it considerably more difficult and dangerous to use for the traditional transportation and hunting purposes that many coastal communities have relied on for generations. Warming waters are also beginning to shift the broader marine ecosystem surrounding Greenland in ways that scientists say could meaningfully affect the fish populations. The territory's export economy depends on so heavily, though researchers are still working to understand precisely how significant and how rapid those ecological shifts will ultimately prove to be. At the very same time that warming is creating genuine challenges for the traditional fishing economy, it's also, somewhat paradoxically, beginning to open new economic possibilities tied directly to the mineral wealth beneath Greenland's retreating ice, the exact resources driving so much of the current American strategic interest in the first place. As ice recedes and previously inaccessible terrain becomes reachable, mineral exploration and extraction that would have been logistically prohibitive or physically impossible in past decades is gradually becoming more technically and economically feasible. This creates a genuinely complicated, double-edged dynamic for Greenland's economic future. The very same warming trend threatening the fishing industry that has sustained Greenlandic communities for centuries is simultaneously making the territory's untapped mineral wealth more accessible, potentially offering the exact kind of economic diversification that could reduce Greenland's dependence on both fishing and Danish financial support, the two pillars its current fragile economy rests on. Whether that mineral wealth ultimately gets developed through partnership with Denmark, the European Union, the United States, or some entirely different arrangement remains one of the central open questions hanging over Greenland's economic future, deeply intertwined with the broader sovereignty and independence debates currently playing out across the territory's political landscape. So, returning to the original question, why do 50,000 or so people choose to live somewhere this remote, this economically fragile, and increasingly this geopolitically contested? Part of the answer is simply that, for the overwhelming majority of residents, this is not a foreign, forbidding landscape they've chosen against more comfortable alternatives. It's home in the fullest and most literal sense of that word. It's where their families have lived for generations, in many cases for over 1,000 years, developing a body of cultural knowledge, tradition, and adaptation specifically suited to thriving in exactly this environment, not merely enduring it. The Inuit heritage that shapes the identity of roughly 90% of Greenland's population isn't a historical curiosity confined to museums. It's an active, living culture, expressed daily through language, food, traditional practices, and a deep, practical relationship to the land and sea that surrounds every coastal community across the territory. Part of the answer is also economic, in a more straightforward sense than the fragile GDP figures might initially suggest. For families embedded in the fishing industry, particularly in Greenland's smaller coastal villages, this represents a viable, functioning livelihood, one directly connected to skills and knowledge passed down across generations, rather than some desperate last resort in the absence of better alternatives elsewhere. And significantly, for many residents, remaining in Greenland is fundamentally an act of political and cultural assertion. Decades of gradual movement toward greater self-governance, culminating in the substantial autonomy granted through the 2009 Self-Government Act, reflect a population that has actively worked over a long period of time toward greater control over their own affairs and their own homeland, rather than simply accepting whatever arrangement outside powers, first Denmark historically, and now the United States more recently, might prefer to impose on them. Choosing to stay, in that specific context, carries real political weight, an active assertion of Greenlandic identity and sovereignty precisely at a moment when that sovereignty faces genuinely unprecedented external pressure from one of the most powerful nations on Earth. None of this is to suggest that daily life in Greenland is without serious, ongoing hardship, because it plainly involves navigating real and significant challenges that most people living in more temperate, economically diversified nations never have to confront. Winters bring extended periods of complete darkness in the northernmost reaches of the territory. Healthcare access in Greenland's more remote coastal villages can require lengthy travel by boat and small aircraft, given the near total absence of connecting roads between most settlements. The economy remains genuinely narrow and vulnerable, heavily exposed both to fluctuations in a single dominant industry and to the political decisions made in Copenhagen regarding continued financial support. And now, layered directly on top of all of these existing, long-standing challenges, residents find themselves navigating an entirely unprecedented situation. Watching the President of the United States openly, repeatedly discuss acquiring their homeland, a proposal the overwhelming majority of them have made unmistakably clear they do not want, expressed through both organized street protests and consistent statements from their own elected political leadership. What happens next for Greenland remains genuinely uncertain and depends on a complicated, interconnected set of unresolved questions that are all actively playing out simultaneously. Whether the United States ultimately continues pursuing acquisition through diplomatic, economic, or potentially other forms of pressure, whether Denmark's recently increased investment succeeds in genuinely strengthening its relationship with Greenland's population, whether Greenland's own independence movement continues gaining political momentum toward eventual full sovereignty, and whether accelerating climate change ultimately transforms the territory's economy toward mineral extraction and away from its traditional, centuries-old reliance on fishing, are all questions without clear, settled answers as of right now. What does remain clear, and has remained remarkably consistent throughout this entire past year of intensifying international attention, is the position of the people who actually live there. 56,699 residents, according to the most recent count, choosing, in the face of economic fragility, brutal winters, and now unprecedented geopolitical pressure from the world's most powerful nation, to remain rooted to this vast, largely frozen island. Not because they lack other options, but because this specific, difficult, remarkable place genuinely is, in every meaningful sense of the word, home.